All right, welcome back. This week, we're going to sort of wrap up our discussion of siliciclastic environments as we move down depositional dip, if you will, and we'll end up here in deep-water environments for this lecture, and particularly focused on turbidity currents and density currents. And then in the next lecture, we'll kind of move in a bit of a tangent, if you will, for the last siliciclastic environment of the semester, where we'll talk about aeolian or windblown sedimentation. Okay, so for this first lecture, we're moving offshore and into the deep water environment, and having a look at some of the processes that may or may not be all that familiar or intuitive to many of you. Most of us don't observe deep water processes on a regular basis, unlike with, say, rivers or fans or deltas. And so some of these processes may be a little bit less intuitive. You have seen the lab by now with some of the experiments, some of those videos that I've shown from those experiments. And so we're going to kind of take that sort of lab process intuition, build upon it a little bit with some terminology and some discussion about the deep water environments that those kinds of currents occur in, and ultimately start to build ourselves a facies model for deep water facies as well. And by way of a definition, deep water environment generally refers to the environment below which storm waves are no longer impacting the bed, right? So for a relatively large storm event, say a hurricane or something of that nature, the storm waves are no longer reaching the bed, interacting with the bed, causing sediment transport to rework bed sediment at that depth. So, somewhere on the order of tens to hundreds of meters deep and deeper. Okay. And in these cases, the dominant sediment transport process that drives deposition is suspension settle out from the water column and sediment gravity flows. And we're going to focus here primarily on sediment gravity flows and how they transition from the flow itself into a sort of a suspension settle out regime. Okay. And the reason that this is a critical component to focus on is that sediment gravity flows are considered volumetrically the most important sediment transport process globally. They move more sediment than any other transporting mechanism by volume. And so the relative proportion of Earth's stratigraphic record that one might expect to be made up of these could be quite large. Okay, there's a bunch of preservation bias and so forth that can kind of go into more subtleties about that. But generally speaking, most of the depositional environments on Earth are in the deep water regime, and most of the deep water regime sedimentation by volume is dominated by gravity flows. And they are very effective at transporting coarser sediment from the shelf into deep water environments, right? As you imagine, we had a delta or a river that's entering the ocean and it's delivering its coarse sediment, whether that's sand or gravel or cobbles, and it loses its momentum very close to the shoreline, and a river is not very effective at moving cobbles out very far on a delta front, for example, and out off the shelf edge. And so if you're trying to move that coarse sediment further out into the deep water regime, these sediment gravity flows are a very effective way of doing that. And that becomes important if you're interested in things like sand resources is one reason why you might be interested in that. Another reason to be interested in something like that is that these coarse clastic bodies of sediment can create large reservoirs of hydrocarbon accumulation. So if you're in the exploration production industries. They're quite important, and a significant amount of the petroleum reserves certainly in the Gulf of Mexico and as well as elsewhere are housed in these deep water sediment gravity flow deposits. Okay. And one kind of cool thing to think about is although the transport processes are significantly different in detail, there are a lot of first order similarities between submarine depositional environments, sediment gravity flows, and density currents, as well as river networks, fluvial networks, right? So you can see here in this image, we have these lovely meanders from the Amazon River on land. This is the terrestrial Amazon River. If you go to the Amazon submarine channel further offshore, where significant amounts of sediment gravity flows are derived from that deposited sediment out on that comes out of the mouth of the Amazon River. It gets deposited on the shelf. That shelf generates turbidity currents by a number of different mechanisms, which we'll talk about a little bit later, slope failure, etc. And those sediment gravity currents can become any number of type of current, and they can form these submarine canyons and submarine channels that behave in similar ways, albeit with fairly distinct differences, such as the ability to super elevate the channel above the surrounding area. They can form these nice meandering single-threaded channels that can stretch, hundreds of kilometers, right? There's one offshore here in the Gulf of Mexico that stretches almost the entire length of Florida, essentially offshore. You can find that in BOEM data. I think I showed that in a discussion session a couple of weeks ago, maybe. And similar to fluvial drainage networks, right? You can just like you can get integration of drainage networks and tributary and distributary systems in fluvial systems, you can get similar in submarine systems. For example, here is a bathymetry map showing here's the sort of the shelf is up here. The stripes are from seismic profiling, and so the data up here is not that great, but you can see these submarine channels and canyons that are forming this tributary network, just like you might expect to see in a river system, right? You have headwater channels almost up here at the top of the slope, and they are integrating to form one, larger submarine canyon network, right? Just as you might expect to see in a river and delta system. You might also see, for example, here's some seismic data that's cutting across some of these submarine channels, and you can see, just like we saw in the fluvial system, you have the channel, you have a levee complex, right? You have channels and levees, and then you get the sort of elevation of parts of that channel above what you would call in the fluvial system a floodplain, but what is just the abyssal plain here in the deep water setting. And one thing that's kind of interesting to note in a lot of these deep water settings, that while this same process happens, unlike in fluvial settings where you can only super elevate about one channel depth, such that the bed of the river is at the elevation of the floodplain, you often see very, very highly super elevated submarine channels, some number of 2 to 6 times the channel depth elevated above the surrounding abyssal plain. That's not uncommon to see. Similarly to fluvial systems, fluvial networks, you get these kind of graded concave up profiles. So here's a system. These are a number of fluvial river profiles here off the Congo deep sea fan, right? So off Angola, and then you can see the submarine channel has a similarly graded profile to, again, you can kind of see that concave upwards profile to that submarine channel. And if you measured out even further, it would kind of taper off and flatten out a bit. Okay. Much like fluvial networks, just as we said, they can super elevate and they can also avulse, right? And so you get avulsions that lead to lobe switching, just like you would on a delta or in a fluvial system, right? And that's a very common feature of submarine fan complexes. You get the distributary system developed from the channel, leaving the steep continental slopes out onto the abyssal plain. It starts to form a distributary network where one channel might be active at one time, and you get multiple lobes as they super elevate, avulse, switch, and so forth. Okay. And so this is a relatively common fan architecture for one of these, or fan plan form, if you will, for one of these submarine canyons here, or submarine fans. This is the Congo deep sea fan, where you can see there's old generations of fan complexes, and then the modern generation of fan complexes, which has multiple channels that had been active at various times, not necessarily all active now, but because of recent avulsions have formed new lobes as the channels have evolved. Okay. And so, those are some of the similarities, but in order to get at the distinctions between them, primarily the process distinctions internally, we and how we might start to think about teasing out a submarine from a fluvial stratigraphic response, we can start to think about what the details of the actual flow itself are, right? So in a river system, we've talked about bed load and suspended load. They're relatively low concentration flows. We talked a little bit about how the velocity profile looks for a river system and how that manifests itself in how the river transports sediment, right? But there's some fundamental differences in the dynamics of a turbidity current versus a river system. And so we can classify sediment gravity flows a little bit based on some features of the flow that help us to start thinking about how they might behave in the submarine environment, and how that might cause them to differ from things like rivers. And so we're going to make sort of two bulk classifications and then some sort of narrower classifications within that. The first largest scale being the difference between a turbidity current and a debris flow. Okay. A turbidity current is a still very high concentration of sediment in the water column, right? We're talking about 1% or 10% suspended sediment by volume, whereas in a fluvial system, you might be talking about 0.001 or 0.0001%, right? You're talking about much, much larger sediment concentrations in these sediment gravity flows. And because of those high concentrations of suspended sediment, the flow itself becomes denser than the surrounding water column, okay? And that's what allows them to flow down slope and maintain momentum as they travel, right? And then debris flows are generally about a 50-50 mixture of sediment and water in the submarine environment, and so that allows them to behave a little bit differently. The body of the flow itself might behave more like almost a block, if you will, a rigid body that's getting sort of advected down slope, as opposed to a fluid that is turbulent, it is undergoing shear, it is mixing, and so forth, like you would see in a turbidity current. And because of that of that difference in rheology of these types of flows, you get different deposits. And so it's important to start thinking about what the differences might be and how they might behave slightly differently, and how the sediment might get sorted and transported within that flow slightly differently. So we're going to kind of build upon that as we go through this lecture, right? And so to give you a little bit of terminology and almost like a flow chart, if you will, of how we determine what kinds of sediment gravity flows we're dealing with from a process standpoint, there are two sort of initiations, if you will, of sediment gravity flows. The first one being a failure of a slope, and the second one being what's called a hyperpycnal flow. Now, a hyperpycnal flow is when a river enters a body of water with high suspended sediment concentrations. It has to be high enough to be sufficiently dense that when it reaches a certain depth, it's no longer able to maintain the, push out enough water to maintain the full water column thickness of that dense sediment-laden flow, and at a certain point it starts to plunge under the main water column. This is much more common in freshwater environments, like if you have a high suspended sediment concentration river flowing into a deep lake, for example. This can be very common. There's some great examples in I believe either the French or Swiss Alps. I believe it's at the mouth of the River Seine when it enters into a reservoir or a lake, where you get beautiful hyperpycnal flows. And you can get them sometimes in seawater, but if you recall, seawater has higher density than fresh water because of the salinity, and so you have to have high enough concentration of sediment to not just overcome the density of water, of fresh water, but overcome the density of the salt water as well. But in both of these cases, a hyperpycnal flow or a slope failure, if the slope failure has a rapid addition of water because of the dynamics internally, if it's starting to incorporate water into that mess of sediment as it's flowing down slope, essentially, if the sediment concentration goes down because of incorporation of water, you can end up with a turbidity current from a slope failure or a hyperpycnal flow. Okay, this would be more likely to be the most common, I would say. Slope failures would be the more common generator of turbidity currents, at least in my expectation or understanding of how these systems work. Okay, slope failures can also lead to high concentration flows, and we can classify these in a couple of different ways. If they have extensive internal deformation, if the sediment inside that flow is deforming by shear, then you end up calling it a debris flow. If it doesn't have that much deformation and moves just as one cohesive block, we would call that a slide or a slump. Okay, and we're going to primarily concentrate on turbidity currents and debris flows, but we'll touch a little bit on some slide and slump dynamics as we go through this lecture too. And so we'll talk about the triggering mechanisms of slope failure in particular for generating these debris flows and turbidity currents. And there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of really interesting literature about the triggers that may be associated with developing these slides and debris flows in such a way that they can start to generate turbidity currents. You can get them in a number of ways at the shelf slope kind of environment. Any process that might agitate a large portion of that environment can potentially produce a slide that could potentially produce a debris flow or a turbidity current. And so those kinds of triggers could include waves and currents associated with large storm events. It can be associated with unusually low tides, right? As the pore pressures change relative to the surrounding water pressure, that can be driven by tides. It can also the tides can also drive hyporheic flow, if you will, groundwater flow through the slope or the continental shelf. And you can get overpressuring of certain portions of a slope of pore pressure, pore water pressure that can cause collapse and failure through different mechanisms. Earthquakes can do this. It's actually the first sort of known timed, well understood turbidity current was generated by an earthquake off Nova Scotia in the early 1900s. I believe early 1900s, it may have been late 1800s, which was actually a really cool event where the earthquake occurred, and they were able to track the migration of the turbidity current associated with that earthquake, because the slope failed, and as the turbidity current progressed, something like, I think it was 1900 kilometers, but there's plenty of information on Google about this if I'm not remembering it correctly. As it went, it severed a number of transatlantic telegraph cables, and the timing of the severing of those transatlantic telegraph cables was able to tell scientists what the speed of that current was. Now, at the time that it occurred, they didn't know that that was the cause, right? But that data and information was later able to be used and contextualized in that way. Slopes that have been oversteepened by tectonic forcings, if you get a fault or you get a salt diapir or something like that can oversteepen a slope, it can result in failure. But there's also the potential that you just get autogenic failure. Now, autogenic means the sort of internal dynamic derived. So it's not necessarily derived from a specific triggering event, but the fact that, if you have high sediment delivery from a river, for example, and it's just piling up, that slope can eventually just oversteepen and then collapse, and then it piles up, piles and oversteepens and collapses, and so on and so on. Just kind of like the dune leaf faces, how you see in the experiments, how the dune leaf faces, you get sediment delivered, it oversteepens, fails, oversteepens, fails, oversteepens, fails, and that's how dunes migrate forward. Similar kind of situation can occur on a shelf slope break in front of a delta, for example. And it doesn't take a lot of steepness in these sediment, in these deepwater environments to trigger the generation of a turbidity current or a submarine debris flow. There have been modern examples of slope failures in deposits where the surface slopes have been as small as 0.1 degrees. So that's like imperceptible to your eye. You wouldn't notice a 0.1 degree slope, but because of how these currents, because of their dynamics and their ability to mobilize once they start moving, you can generate one of these currents on a slope that's very small if there's just enough instability, enough internal pore pressure that builds up, etc. Okay. So here's just a couple of examples, or here's one example of a really neat set of field experiments that were done off of the Monterey Canyon in California. There's a beautiful submarine canyon, and I'll show some images of it later, in off the coast of California, off of Monterey Bay. If anybody's heard of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, they're actually that aquarium is a big player in the research that's involved on the Monterey Submarine Canyon Complex, and they put out a huge deployment, and I'll show some more really cool data from that a little later in this lecture, of acoustic Doppler current profilers and a bunch of other instrumentation in this very, very deep canyon. And they measured a series of turbidity currents that occurred over their deployment period. You can see it's about 2 years, a year and a half or so of deployment time. And you can see, so here are the in dashed lines, these are the turbidity currents that were generated that are shown up here. And these bars up here show where the turbidity current was thought to originate from, and you can see that most of them originated from relatively shallow positions, right? And if you look at these dotted lines, right, one of the first thoughts was, well, maybe turbidity currents are generated by high river discharge events. As the river discharge increases, you get more sediment supply, it oversteepens, and then it can fail. But you can see that you're getting tons of turbidity currents generated with very low discharge. This is the discharge curve here in sort of this light purple, right? And so the other thought is, well, maybe it's derived from waves. You can kind of see that these are significant wave heights or maximum wave heights here on plot B. You can see that there is a little bit of overlap in the wave height versus turbidity current, you can see these 3 turbidity currents or 4 that were all generated right after another were at a very significant wave event, for example, but not all of them, right? And so you can see that it's a complex process and that it's not necessarily one trigger, even in one location, that may be causing these turbidity currents to happen. Some may be autogenic, some may be waves, some may be river discharge, some may be an earthquake, though there were no earthquakes during this time. Okay. So this is kind of a really cool study. This is a very huge group that has been going out there and doing these studies for the last several years, and they've come out with some just spectacular data. If you're ever in the mood to look at really, really cool submarine data, that's the place to go. And ultimately, these things result in constructional topography. So as you're migrating the sediment by way of turbidites or by submarine debris flows, you end up building up topography on the seafloor as that sediment moves from that canyon by its various triggering mechanisms out into the deep water, out into the abyssal plain. And you end up with, like we showed here, this is a meandering channel off the Amazon fan, I believe, here, and you end up with these super elevated channels. You can see the actual channel depths much higher than the channel base much higher than the abyssal plain here. And if you look across, you get these really neat lobe features, right? That are in this case indicative of these slump or slide or debris flow type deposits here, right? So these would be your turbidite deposits with nice channel levee complexes, at least in the proximal region here. If you got out further, you might see sandier lobes deposited, but they would still have a sort of a central channel at most part. Relative to these sort of constructional blobs, if you will, lobes that are associated with the debris flow deposits, okay? One really kind of cool thing about the dynamics of debris flow deposits is that oftentimes you see, here's a great bathymetric image where there's a bunch of debris flow, loby, large debris flow kind of fields here, but then you see that there's these debris flow blocks, right? There's chunks that make it way further out than the rest of the flow. And this is a really cool feature that occurs in debris flow deposits, which is that there is hydroplaning that occurs. So as a flow cruises along the bottom of the seafloor, a block can hydroplane on top of the surrounding water, and it can make it out, tens to hundreds of kilometers further even. So this is a demonstration of that in a flume setting here. I believe this is in Minnesota, although I can't confirm that. So that's kind of a cool feature that you might expect to see in situations where the constructional topography is generated by these debris flow systems. Okay, and what the internal velocity structure might look like for some of these, and this will become relevant when we start thinking about building our facies models, is like so. For the open channel case, here's the classic law of the wall. The black line is the velocity profile, right? This dashed line would be like a sediment concentration profile. So if you recall, when we talked about suspended sediment, this was the Rouse profile here, right? And the shear stress profile is given here, right? So in our case, we're in a Newtonian fluid, so the shear stress is a linear relationship. We have a free surface at the top in open channel flow, and that's the most important distinction here, right? When we get into turbidity currents, we no longer have a free surface, right? There's no shear, or effectively zero shear in an open channel at the top surface, because there's not that much friction associated with shearing past air at the speeds that water is going, right? So we consider that a free surface, so there's no stress generated. The velocity profile doesn't flip backwards here, right? Doesn't slow down at the upper water surface. But in turbidity currents, which are surrounded on all sides by water, there is shear with the bed and shear with the ambient fluid, okay? And what that results in is a velocity profile that looks like this, right? Where the sort of low central point of the current will be moving the fastest, right? There's a high amount of shear here along the bed, so there's a steep gradient in velocity as you go up from the bed, and then a shallower gradient as you go up towards the ambient fluid, right? And so as a result of that, well, you get turbulent mixing that goes on here, right? So as you create shear between the ambient fluid and the gravity current or turbidity current, you can get mixing, just like you would get mixing of sediment with water, right? When you shear the sediment, you start to entrain it into the flow. Similar thing happens when you start to shear this surface between the water and the turbidity current. You get turbulent structures that start to incorporate that ambient fluid or that water into the turbidity current, which will cause it to lose density downstream or downflow. And then finally, when you get to debris flows, you end up with what sort of ends up being a relatively coherent core of the debris flow, where you have a relatively high amount of shear down here at the bottom, and you might get lofting, and you might get that hydroplaning occurring. So that results in, relatively low, you might get relatively slow speeds along here because of that high shear and lofting and other sorts of phenomena. And then when you get towards the center of the debris flow, you get the relatively fast speeds, but it's a relatively coherent block of fast moving flow. The debris flow, remember, is still shearing, right? But it's not moving, but it's moving much more coherently than a turbidity current is. And again, you still get shear along the upper surface with the ambient fluid, so you eventually end up with a zero velocity term at the upper fluid interface as well. And one of the kind of key differences between turbidity currents and the debris flows because of this is that the concentration field is maybe a little bit more highly concentrated in the upper part of the flow relative to the turbidity currents, okay? And these can evolve down slope to become turbidity currents as they start to incorporate more and more fluid, more and more ambient fluid into their structure along this sheared interface, okay? Again, here's some graphical representations of what that might look like, right? So here's a turbidity current up here, and again, you can see it's a relatively it's subject to significant internal mixing, lower concentrations, so there's more turbulent behavior in the internal portion of this flow, and so the velocity field is going to kind of reflect that a little bit more, that there's, that it's going to slow down at this surface, because of that shear. Now, in this particular image, I think this is referring a little bit more to a more cohesive debris flow than the one that you might see here, right? And that results in a more plug-like behavior where the entire upper portion of that flow, in this case, is moving as sort of one plug. This is a little bit more of a cohesive situation than the previous velocity profile that was shown, right? Where the whole body is moving as more of a plug and not deforming internally as much as it would have with the previous velocity profile, okay? But one thing you'll notice here is at the head of this flow, right? You don't really talk about the head of a flow of a fluvial system because it's not that, because it's assumed to be so far away that it's not relevant in all cases. But when a debris flow initiates, right, the flow starts off at some interface here between the ambient water and the flow itself, and the dynamics of this head are actually really interesting. There's shear that goes along the entire margin here, right? And so as you can imagine, as this thing is moving down slope and you have high velocity at the base and lower velocity at the top, you're going to get this sort of circulation effect here, where this part of the sediment gravity flow is going to be sheared upwards and around. And that's actually a really key component of incorporating fluid into the density current, right? So as this thing shears around, you get incorporation of ambient fluid up here, right? You can also get what's called lofting, which you probably saw, you may not have noticed in the experiments that I showed, right? Where this part of the current, because of that sort of that curvature and so forth, you get a little bit of flow of fresh water or you know, ambient water that sort of gets ridden underneath that flow and creates a little bit of a cushion and can actually cause that current to flow even further out and reduce the friction along the basal part of that current. And so these can result in different types of sediment deposits, and you can start to think about how the different dynamics might result in different types of depositional features. So we can start out with the debris flow, for example. And a debris flow might be a relatively poor sorting system that might result in very mixed grain sizes, not a lot of internal structure, just a conglomerate, if you will. And we would call that a debrite, as it's referred to in the literature. You can get what are called hybrid or transitional flows. In this case, a cogenetic flow is one that has a turbidity current off at the front and then a debris flow that comes up in the tail. And so in this case, you might get that sandier, more sorted. And what happens in these turbidity currents is you get bedding that grades and fines upwards. So as the high energy, high concentration head of the flow moves past, you get deposition of coarse sediment. And then as the tail starts to move past and you incorporate more and more water into that flow, and you lose the ability to entrain coarse sediment because the momentum decreases of that flow, then you get finer and finer sediments deposited as the flow progresses. And that's true for all of these turbidity current types in some sense or another. And you know, you can get what are called cogenetic flows if that turbidity current is immediately followed up by the debris flow that may have originated the turbidity current and so forth. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these later, but this would be a typical progression of, say, a turbidity current or a turbidity current with a debris flow following it and so forth. This is sort of a continuum, if you will, from high concentration down to low concentration flow. All right. And we'll get into more detail on, in particular, this case here, the lower density turbidity current structure in a little bit. But these variations through stratigraphic space have a component of lateral variability as well, I should say, right? In that if you're closer towards the slope, you might be more likely to get either a debris flow or a high concentration turbidity current, and that the flow concentration oftentimes will decrease as the flow runs out onto the abyssal plane. Now that's not always true. Sometimes you initiate with something like a low density or a low concentration flow, like say if you had a situation where you started out with a hyperpycnal flow. So it starts out as a low concentration or lower concentration turbidity current, and because of the momentum and because of the shear stress exerted by that flow on the bed, as it runs out, it can either incorporate more sediment and become a more high density flow, or it can trigger other failure mechanisms along its way and can actually result in a more high density flow environment. And you might see that reflected in the stratigraphy if you had, you know, more sandy, finer grain material up here, and then coarser conglomeratic material made up of the surrounding, you know, muds, for example, further downslope. You might think that could have resulted from an increasing density flow. Okay. and some of the nomenclature that we use, and I didn't put this in too much detail in the lab, but it still showed up there in a little bit. And in particular, the most important ones, I think, for what we'll talk about are, right, that we can describe a turbidity current at any point along its length by its height, right? You can describe it by its suspended sediment concentration, just like in any other flow, the proportion of the flow that is made up of sediment. It has some velocity in the down dip direction. It might have some sediment concentration at the base, and then it decreases upwards, right? It has a maximum velocity. And you can sort of parameterize and start to describe individual types of turbidity currents using any of these terminology. We won't go into too much detail, but note that they might show up if you're dealing with turbidity current literature and trying to describe them in a lab experiment setting or in the field. You might be interested in understanding what the height or the velocity of the head versus the body of the turbidity current was, for example. Okay, so that's sort of just to give you a little bit of a primer on some of the terminology that gets used for some of these currents. One thing that you'll note here, this term here referred to as KH billows on here is actually a really cool feature. And we saw this in the lab, and I'll show you a video of that in the next slide. These KH billows are what are referred to as Kelvin-Helmholtz billows or Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. And it's a turbulent mixing phenomenon or a turbulent shear wave phenomena that as you shear two fluids against each other, they start to roll over into each other and mix. And that's what's occurring at the top surface of these turbidity currents in order to entrain fresh water into the turbidity current. You may have seen these in other settings as well. They show up relatively prominently in atmospheric situations. You might see a set of clouds that has these KH waves. They look like these sharp peaked, almost like your cartoon wave, if you will. I saw them on my bike ride here in New Orleans on Saturday morning. They're not that common to see here, but I've seen them in pretty spectacular form. And if anybody asks me about them next week at our discussion session, I'll show you the pictures that I found on or that I took from this week. But that's a relatively common mixing phenomenon, and you can see that here in this experiment, right? You can see those billows, and you can see how they've got these sort of peaked shears that sort of roll over in this direction here, right? You can see. Let's see if I can find you a really good one. There's a great one. There's a good one, right? As they billow, they sort of they wrap around just like that, right? And they start to incorporate water into the structure of the turbidity current, okay? This is this experimental turbidity current that we ran in class just had all the classic dynamics. Here you can see lofting. You can see how the turbidity current itself isn't really riding along the bed. There's a thin veneer of water underneath it, right? So it's incorporating water under the sediment and riding over a bed of water instead of riding over a bed of sediment, which heavily reduces the shear and allows it. Right now this slope is completely flat, right? So it's moving just purely under the momentum of the flow generated up above. This one goes, this flow moved about 50 feet before it reached the end of the tank, and only, descended maybe 5 or 6 inches over that entire length. So 5 or 6 inches over 50 feet is a really small slope, right? And yet it had enough momentum to move, we're talking centimeters a second here, which is a pretty interesting dynamic. So there's a lot of cool features that you can notice in this. You can see those billows at the head, right? You can see that shear occurring. You can see all that circulation or shearing that's going on right at the head. And you can see how much lower density the current is, or lower concentration the current is in the body as it flows slower, mixes further, incorporates more water, and becomes more dilute. Okay. And so some of the progression of these, this is a laboratory example at very small scale. They scale up quite a bit. So here's again some data from that Monterey Canyon from that same research group. This is the Monterey Canyon bathymetry here. It's it's on the order of maybe 15 kilometers or so. I don't have the exact canyon length here for you, but so what we're showing here are these are ADCP moorings, acoustic Doppler current profiler moorings, showing the velocity in the color bar here. And each of these moorings from top to bottom is from top to bottom of the canyon, right? So this is MS7, SIN, MS6, I believe must have gotten lost. So MS5, MS4, 3, 2, and 1 here, right? So going down canyon, and they're all tied to the same timeline. So this is in time, and you can see as one of these are two different turbidity currents of different sizes and concentrations that were generated here. And you can see at the very first one, right, that swamped out, and it actually overwhelmed the velocity measurement window of the ADCP. So it was both too high velocity and too high concentration for the ADCP to actually measure the velocity there, which, that's 8 meters a second or more, and a huge amount of concentration. This is the acoustic backscatter, which you can kind of think of as a proxy for sediment concentration. Okay, and you can see that it progresses over hours of time to move down these, several kilometers, right? This is almost 2.5 hours from when it started to when it reached this MS7 out here, getting closer towards the outlet of the canyon, right? And the same thing here for this lower concentration flow. You can see the velocity at the initial point was actually a lot lower, and it actually appears, at least to my eye, to maybe even be speeding up as it goes down slope, right? The velocity here was slower and smaller, or was slower in these early ADCPs, and is actually a little bit faster here at the core in its sort of mid reaches here at MS5. Okay, and you can also see that from the backscatter, it appears to potentially have grown quite a bit, right? So this turbidity current may be picking up steam as it goes, as opposed to this one, which maybe is slowing down as it goes. So that's kind of cool. Right, so here's a zoom in of some of that, and you can see really clearly in these two figures that the velocity profile demonstrates the sort of geometry of that turbidity current very well, right? You see the high velocity head and body, and then you can see that it slows down in the core and the tail as you get towards the tail of the turbidity current, but you still have relatively high velocities even for an hour later at any particular location. Same thing here as you get further down slope, right? And so what this results in is this deceleration in velocity, which is also accompanied here, as you can see, by a decrease in the backscatter or the sediment concentration as the flow passes by any particular point. Is you get a deposit that reflects that decelerating velocity field and that decreasing concentration field, right? And you get deposits that grade, right? So that go from one grain size to another. And in particular, in turbidity current environments, they go from coarse grain sizes to reflect that high energy, high shear stress, high sediment concentration head. As that head passes you and you drop out that coarse sediment, first off, you get scour oftentimes at the base, right? So as the bed, as the first part of the turbidity current passes by, it may erode sediment, right? And you get a scoured base. Then you get coarse material deposited on top of that scoured base, and that might grade upwards, right? In this particular instance, from from coarse sediment up to fine sediment, right? And then that process may repeat itself over again here, right? So what you end up getting in these particular types of cases where you have a very mixed grain size flow is you get a pronounced what's called normal grading. Normal grading means you're going from coarse to fine up section, right? You're fining upwards, you'd hear that referred to. Okay, and that's not necessarily solely indicative of turbidity currents, but it is a hallmark feature of turbidity currents. Okay, and what we would refer to as turbidite deposits, the rocks that are formed by turbidity currents, are turbidites. Okay, you see that kind of nomenclature. We've talked about that before, right? A turbidity current results in a turbidite. A debris flow results in a debrite, right? And so forth. I will caution everyone when I say these things against using those terms too loosely. A turbidite implies that you have already made the interpretation based on the evidence you have that it was derived from a turbidity current. You may not always be able to make that determination. So a turbidite deposit has this classic sequence to it as you go up section that responds, or that is the response to these changes in depositional velocity, if you will, or shear stress within the current. And you get what's referred to as the BOMA sequence. It's a sequence that starts out with the deposition from the head of the turbidity current, and then as the turbidity current passes over you and has incorporated more flow, more fluid into it, lowers the concentration, slows down, you end up progressing through this sequence where you start out here with a graded bed from, gravel to sand, right, at the base. You have a scoured base oftentimes, or a loaded base. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And that would be referred to as sequence A, and it's massive, it's graded, represents upper flow regime and rapid deposition, right? Then in the next regime, you end up with planar parallel laminations of sand, and that reflects that upper plane bed flow, right? That follows after you've kind of done your massive dump of sand. Now you're in an upper flow regime, plane bedded flow at that Froude critical situation. And then as the flow evolves further, you get into the C bed, where you get into sand and silt deposits that might be rippled, or they might have some sort of convoluted kind of shear down slope-ish laminations. So this would be referred to as C, as a C horizon or C bed. And this reflects the lower part of the lower flow regime, right? The rippled sands, low Froude conditions, low suspension number conditions, etc. And then you get up into the upper parallel laminated sands and silts, which would be your D horizon, as you sort of move into this suspension settle out regime, right? And then you end up with a mud horizon, which reflects the sort of after the turbidite has gone, the turbidity current has passed by, you get your abyssal plain sedimentation, and then the process might start over again. Okay, and so what that might look like in an outcrop is sometimes, if you're lucky, you might get what's called a complete BOMA succession here, and it's often denoted as TA, TB, and so forth to reflect that it's a turbidite bed A, turbidite bed B, associated with those horizons that were labeled there on the previous figure. Again, your massive sands, then your plain laminated sands, then your rippled sands, right? And then your plain laminated silts, and then muds here, which are recessive in this case and not really very well shown. So this would be a complete BOMA succession. You can see the sort of shape of this base here indicates that it's either scoured or loaded into the previously deposited muds. Okay. You might also expect to see in a lot of cases incomplete BOMA successions, ones that don't have all the pieces but might have some, depending on the energetics or the completeness of the succession, right? Or you might start with a B horizon. You don't have the massive bedded sands, but you might start in that upper plane bed flow and get laminated sands, rippled sands, fine laminated sands and silts, and then that might repeat itself over again if there's not enough time for suspended settling, or if there's more erosion on top, right? So this is a relatively incomplete Oh, I apologize. I misphrased. So it starts here, and then it repeats here, and then it repeats there again. So you may be missing any number of those horizons in any particular case, right? Here's another great example of what that might look like. Here's another A horizon, laminated B horizon, rippled C horizon, laminated D horizon, and then your muddy E horizon would be up here. Okay, and you can see again the muddy horizon down here. So that's the base, and the succession is moving up in this direction. One thing you might expect to see on the base are evidence of loading or traction or scour. And in this case, this is a feature that's referred to as a flute cast, and it's associated with, so this is the bottom of a sandy horizon that's here. So here's that surface that would, so this is the bottom, it's up is sort of this direction here. And you can see the mud here down lower. This would be your E horizon of the previous, abyssal plain sedimentation. And then these features are loading down. It's sand that's filling in the mud that was potentially scoured out by vortices at the base of that flow as it moved past, right? And you can see they have this kind of interesting cuspate shape. It's all pointing in the same kind of downslope direction, right? Or in the same sort of consistent direction. You can see here's another horizon of them here, and they're all kind of scoop shaped pointing in this direction. And that can tell you that the direction of transport was from sort of upper right down to lower left based on the shape of those things. Okay, those are referred to as flute casts, and they occur on the bottom of those beds because of that scour. Here's another example of some loads and flute casts. Again, you can get other types of scour features that may not be directional, although typically in a turbidite deposit you would get these directional flute casts, tool marks, etc. And we talked about some of those in the very first sedimentary structures lecture. This is a very common environment to get them at the base of those A or B horizons that sit on top of the muddy, E horizons, for example. It's a relatively common place to see those, and can help you to start to interpret. Say if you're doing structural geology and you see these, you know which way is up, right? If you see this type of deposit where you see flute casts in outcrop, you can map those out with your Brunton, and you can determine potentially which way was downslope in the past, right? And that can tell you the transport direction of these turbidity currents. It can also tell you which way was stratigraphic up, right? I can tell from looking at this that they're on the bottoms of sand beds is where those get preserved. So that tells me that I'm looking at the bottom of a bed, and so stratigraphic up is in this direction, in towards the page, if you will. So they're very useful in that respect also. Okay. So if you've gone and taken a structural geology course, or if you go out and you're mapping in the field or doing stratigraphy in the field, that's a key feature that you might want to look for to find out whether you're stratigraphically facing, if that makes sense. That's the term we would use for that. Alrighty, so that's kind of the wrap-up of turbidite deposits and how they form stratigraphy and some of the types of features you might expect to see. And so in the next lecture, we'll cover siliciclastic environments, our last lecture of siliciclastic environments, where we talk about aeolian settings and windblown settings. All right,